This is Two Ladies Midwest Adventures. Um, I'm reading Heaven is for Real. I'm on chapter 9. 15 minutes later, maybe more, I emerged from that room dry-eyed. It had been the first time I'd really been alone since the whole ordeal. I wanted to be strong for Sonia, a husband strong for his wife. I found her in the waiting room, using her last drops of cell phone battery to call friends and family. I hugged her and held her as she cried into my shirt, until it stuck to my chest. I used what little battery was left on my cell phone to call Terry, my secretary, who would in turn activate the prayer chain at church. This was not a ritual call. I was desperate for prayer, desperate that other believers would bang on the gates of heaven and beg for the life of our son. Pastors are supposed to be unshakable pillars of faith, right? But at that point, my faith was hanging by a tattered thread and fraying fast. I thought of the times where Scripture says that God answered the prayers of not the sick or dying, but of the friends of the sick or dying. The paralytic, for example. It was when Jesus saw the faith of the man's friends, they told I think it's paralytic. Let me just look it up. Paralytic. I'm reading.
I know. That's where I go.
Shh. Get up, take your mat, and go home. At that moment, I needed to borrow the strength and faith of some other believers. After I hung up with Terry, Sonia and I sat together and prayed. Afraid to hope and afraid not to. Time dragged the minutes, moving at speed of glaciers between unmuted conversations and small talk. The waiting room ticked with a pregnant silence. 90 minutes later, a female nurse in a purple scrubs, a surgical mask dangling from her neck, stepped into the waiting room. Is Colton's father here? The tone of her voice, the fact it was the nurse and not Dr. O'Halloran, sent a surge of hope through my body. Maybe God is being gracious despite our stupidity. Maybe he's going to give us another day, another chance. I stood. I'm Colton's dad. Mr. Burpo, can you come back? Colton's out of surgery, but we can't calm him down. He's still screaming, and he's screaming for you. When they were wheeling Colton away, I couldn't bear his screams. Now suddenly I wanted to hear his screams more than I ever wanted to hear anything in my life. To me, they would be a beautiful sound. Sonia and I gathered up her things and followed the nurse through the wide double doors that led to the surgical ward. We didn't make it to the recovery room, but met a pair of nurses wheeling Colton through the hallway on a gurney. He was alert, and I could tell he'd been looking for me. My first reaction was to try to get as close as I could to him. Think I would have climbed on the gurney with him if I hadn't thought the nurses might feel a little put out. Nurses stopped long enough for Sonia and I each to plant a kiss on little Colton's little face, which still looked pale and drawn. Hey, buddy, how you doing? Hi, Mommy. Hi, Daddy. The ghost of a smile warmed his face. And the nurses got the gurney underway again. A few minutes and the elevator ride later, Colton was set into a narrow hospital room at the end of the long corridor. Sonia stepped out of the room for a moment to take care of some paperwork at the nurse's station, and I stayed behind, sitting next to Colton's bed in one of those mesh-covered rockers, and drinking in my son's aliveness. The small child looked even smaller in a hospital bed built for grown-ups. At under 40 pounds, Colton's body barely raised the sheet. His feet reached no more than a third of the way down the bed. Dark rings still circled his eyes, but it seemed to me that the blue of his eyes shone brighter than 2 hours before. Daddy? Colton looked at me earnestly. What? He gazed at me and didn't move his eyes from mine. Daddy, you know I almost died. Fear gripped me. Where did he hear that? Had he overheard the medical staff talking? Had he had something the surgical team said, despite the anesthesia? Because we certainly hadn't said anything about being close to death in front of him. Sonia and I feared he was at the brink, had known it after we learned that his appendix had been leaking poison into his system for 5 days. But we'd been very careful not to say anything in front of Colton that would scare him. My throat closed, the first sign of tears. Some people freak out when their teenagers want... Oh. I don't like that word.
What word is it?
It's a word I'm just personally sensitive to. There's not really a problem with it. Okay? Don't worry about it, okay?
So I'm just going to skip it. I skip stuff like swear words and that, so.
Oh, okay. Swear words.
It's not actually a swear word, but it's... If you walk into a kindergartner's classroom, it's not a word you'd say. Okay?
Okay.
My throat closed, the first sign of tears. Some people will freak out when their teenagers want to talk about. If you think that's tough, try talking to your preschooler about dying. Colton had been with me in nursing homes, places where people gave their loved ones permission to let go of life. I wasn't about to give my son permission to quit. We weren't out of the woods yet, and I didn't want him to think that death was an option. I willed my voice to remain steady and smiled at my son. You just think about getting better, okay, buddy? Okay, Daddy. We're here with you all the way. We're praying for you. I changed the subject. Now, what can we bring you? Do you want your action figures from home? We hadn't been in the room long when 3 members of our church board arrived at the hospital. We were so grateful for that. Sometimes I wonder, what do people do when they have no extended family and no church? In times of crisis, where does their support come from? Cassie stayed with Norma and Brian in Imperial until my mother, Kay, could drive up from Ulysses, Kansas. Brian's extended family lives in North Platte, and they came to help us too. Our church gathered around us in the eye of the storm, which changed the way Sonia and I approached the pastoral visitation in times of trial and grief. We were faithful about it before, but now we were militant. Soon Sonia came back to the room, and not long after that, Dr. O'Halloran joined us. Colton lay quietly as the surgeon pulled back the sheet to show us the incision site, a horizontal line across the right side of his tiny belly. The wound was packed with blood-tinged gauze, and he began to remove it. Colton whimpered a bit in fear. I don't think he could feel it yet, since he was still under the effects of the local anesthesia. The surgical team had applied to the incision site. Colton's insides were so contaminated with poison of the ruptured appendix that Dr. O'Halloran decided that it was best to leave his incision open so it could continue to drain. Now the doctor spread the wound slightly. See that gray tissue? He said. That's what happens to internal organs when there's an infection. Colton's not going to be able to leave the hospital until everything that's gray in there turns pink. The length of the plastic tube protruding from each side of Colton's abdomen. At the end of each tube was the doctor called a grenade. Clear plastic in color. They did look a little like grenades, but they were actually manual squeeze pumps. Next morning, Dr. O'Halloran showed us how to squeeze the grenades to drain pus from Colton's abdomen. and then pack the opening with fresh gauze. The next few days, Dr. O'Halloran would arrive each morning to check the wound and pack the dressing. Colton screamed bloody murder those visits and began to associate the doctor with everything bad that was happening to him. In the evening, when the doctor wasn't there, I had to drain the incision prior to the surgery. Sonia had been on puke patrol for nearly a week, and since the surgery at Colton's bedside every minute. But draining the pus was a gory work, and for her, a bridge too far. Besides, it took at least 3 adults to hold Colton down, so while I squeezed the grenade, Sonia helped 2 nurses hold him. Sonia whispering soothing words while Colton screamed and screamed. That is the end of chapter 9. I just realized you all couldn't see my face there. Like and subscribe so we can get to 1,000 to start beekeeping. Jenny, help.
Like and subscribe so we can get to 1,000 subscribers so we can start beekeeping.
I said that part.
Stay blessed, make the world a better place, one person or one moment at a time.
That's the part I was looking for. Thank you. Thank you, Dad.
Like and subscribe so we can get to 1,000 subscribers so we can start beekeeping.
Thank you.